Hello, Berks 2020. I am Debbie Gershenowitz from the University of North Carolina Press, and I am delighted to be here today with Alison Parker, the author of UNC Press's forthcoming book, Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell. We wish we were doing this live in person in Baltimore, but in lieu of that, we are going to bring this to your homes and talk a little bit about Alison's book, which we as a press are so excited about publishing. It's the first biography of Terrell in quite a long time. And the book will be available this December, and you all get to benefit from the very first look at the book, which is available for pre-order on our website. You can find it if you do a search, and also we will be hosting a virtual conference page where you'll get to see the beautiful cover, read a little summary of the book. So I hope this piques your interest, and then spread the word about this fabulous book. So Alison, thank you so much for being here today. I want to talk to you about how this book came to be, and then sort of reflections on why it is so important to be reading now. But I want to start with just, I'm sure this is obvious to you and to probably everybody listening, but it just dawned on me today about the timeline of Terrell's life, that she's born months after emancipation to former slaves, and she dies the same year that Brown is passed. And I think that is such a fascinating and apt frame to look at this woman's exceptional lifespan. And her life really serves as a timeline for, I think, all the key points of the long Black freedom movement and the long road toward women's suffrage. So, I think, we already had this built-in fodder in for, so why her, and what do we learn? But what sparked this? She is a known figure. There has been work done on her activism, but we are going to learn a lot of different things about her in this book. So tell us why you decided to do this and what your approach was.
Okay, well, first, one of the things that happened was that I was working on my previous book called Articulating Rights, which was on Black and white women's political thought in the 19th century, where I was featuring different chapters on different activists who made arguments for their full citizenship and their right to vote, and about the relationship of women to the state in the era before women had the right to vote. And she was the last person who I featured in my last chapter. And for each chapter, there was a biographical angle where I had to go in and read biographies and look at their material, not just their political thought or their writings. And I was shocked to find out that the woman who was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1896, and who ended up having this incredibly long career as a journalist, a public speaker, and a civil rights activist for many, many decades, had no scholarly biography written about her at all. There's one written by a woman in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs from the maybe it's the 40s or 60s, but it's an old book, and it's not really a scholarly biography. And so that piqued my interest, and I thought, I really need to know more about her and to see if she has any papers and, what's going on. And so that was really the beginning. So even before I finished my last book, I was already on the path of trying to find out about Mary Church Terrell. And in fact, one of the things that you mentioned is something that I wanted to look into, which is, was she born free or enslaved? And it's a complicated question, because even though her parents were enslaved, and even though she was born, as you say, after emancipation, she was born into a Union-occupied Memphis in Tennessee. And because it was Union occupied, what I discovered is that technically speaking, she was still enslaved, because areas in the South or on border states that were loyal to the Union were able to keep their slaves. So in an interesting context, both her mother and her father, their fathers were the white men who enslaved them. And so both of those men claimed loyalty to the Union and were able to continue being their enslavers. But on the other hand, these were people who, because they were part of their father's lives and enslaved within their families in a more complicated way, because they were slightly recognized, as being different. They did have more quote unquote privileges within a really horrendous system. And so they weren't living entirely as enslaved people, in that they had more freedoms and more training and privileges that in the end allowed them to make a transition to freedom much more quickly into positions of prosperity. And each of them set up, her mother set up a hair salon that had wigs and hair parts for white women who had these super fancy big hairdos. And so when they would go out to balls and things like that, they would go to Lou Ayres Church's hair salon. And her father opened up a saloon, and both of them used their connections with their white enslaver fathers to get the money to start these businesses once the war was over. But that didn't happen until after the war was over.
Right, right. Now she goes on to college, right? She goes to Oberlin, and which is, there's so much right there. Oberlin is the heartbeat of abolitionism, and was the first one of the first universities to admit Black students, correct?
Right, Blacks and women. So
yes,
it was progressive on both fronts. And so, when she was there in the early 1880s, she was with an amazing cohort. Her classmates included Ida Gibbs, who became Ida Gibbs Hunt, and Anna Julia Cooper, and several other quite amazing women. So this is a college that produced women who became leaders and activists, and many of them ended up living and working in Washington, D.C., because the Washington, D.C. public school district, although the schools were segregated, they had a public high school called the M Street. At one point it was called the M Street Colored School, but it was almost like a college preparatory type school in that it had things that other schools for Blacks did not have. Mary Church Terrell, once she graduated from Oberlin, first taught at Wilberforce University, but then was wooed away to teach in the public school system in DC. And she was able to teach Greek and Latin. And so these are subjects that, most formerly enslaved children and other free African Americans were not being taught. And so from the beginning, she was quite different from somebody like Booker T. Washington, who was focusing on technical skills and basic literacy and things like that. And she ended up being quite sympathetic to what he was doing at Tuskegee when she went in the early 1900s. She was invited in 1903 to go to both Atlanta University to speak before a graduation there, invited by W.B. Du Bois. And then she went just a few days later to Tuskegee University because Booker T. Washington didn't want her to speak at Atlanta University without coming to Tuskegee. So interestingly enough, she saw them both, and she said, she was amazed by the graduation ceremony that they had at Tuskegee, where the students literally stood on stage and built things. And so she said it was incredible to watch them build a, kind of a mock building on right up there on the stage. But she was always in favor of higher education, and she married a remarkable man, Robert Heatherton Terrell, who was himself very well educated, but had spent the first 7 years of his life enslaved in Virginia. And he ended up being one of the first graduates who's African American and who went to Harvard. So that was a really big deal. And they were basically a power couple in Washington, D.C. So they focused their lives and lived there for many, many decades. And he ended up becoming the first Black municipal court judge in the District of Columbia, while she became the first Black woman to be on the Board of Education. And that happened in 1895, the year before she became the president of the National Association of Colored Women.
Hi there, this is Alison Parker and Debbie Gershenowitz with part 2 of our talk on Unceasing Militant, the life of Mary Church Terrell. We had a few technical difficulties on Friday, we got a lot of rest, and we are going to now talk about her life in the 20th century. We just finished talking about her early life, her remarkable parents who were in this sort of gray area between slavery and freedom, and used a lot of connections to establish themselves in the wake of the Civil War, and be able to give Mary a wonderful life, and going to Oberlin and then ending up in DC. And we see how she and her husband become this real DC power couple. And so we left off with Alison talking about how Mary was the first president of the National Association for Colored Women. And I believe that happened in the late
96.
96, yes. And so I would like to hear a little bit about how she got there, and then how that very visible role of leadership as a Black woman at a period when the rights of women and the rights of Black men and women are really a top priority for activists. How that early role propels her into the work she does and the public role she plays in the first half of the 20th century. And I'm especially interested in what she's doing, before Brown. We mentioned last week, she dies in 1954, right when a lot is going to change. But that earlier period, Brown wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the work of Mary and others in the decades that led up to the 1950s.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because Mary Church Terrell and W.B. Du Bois and some of these other important figures actually lived during, from the 1860s and 70s forward into the 1950s and 60s and beyond, depending on which person we're talking about. And so they cover and span the whole scope of what's sometimes called the long civil rights movement. So instead of counting it as starting in the 1950s with the bus boycott in Montgomery and things like that, I think you can make a really fair case for the fact that there are some people who were active in both parts of the movement and really set up the later civil rights movement by initiating the same kinds of protests and participating in protests that would become very familiar in what we call the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And so Mary Church Terrell used her leadership in the National Association of Colored Women to fight for suffrage, the right to vote for women and for Black men who were also being disenfranchised by that point at the end of the 19th century. And she started to talk more about anti-lynching and was very critical of the convict lease labor laws, which were very punitive against Blacks in the South. And she was writing a lot of articles and giving a lot of speeches about this, and so became somebody who was involved with the radical militants who ended up founding the NAACP. And I call them radical and militant because they were contrasted against Booker T. Washington's supposedly accommodationist approach. And so she became one of those leaders of the NAACP in a unique position of living in Washington, D.C., rather than in New York City, where Du Bois and some of the other key founders lived. And so she ended up doing a lot of the kind of legislative lobbying legwork in Congress and knew the halls of Congress like the back of her hand. She spent lots and lots of time there over many, many decades. So this was a place that was very familiar to her. And she also was using techniques that became more popular later, in the sense that she participated in the silent sentinel picketing as a suffragist outside the White House. One of the few Black women. She brought her teenage daughter, Phyllis, with her, and they stood out in front of the White House regularly. She did especially. And I think it was really important to note that she was doing this kind of activist work early on. Sometimes people look at her picketing in the 1950s and say that this is what she did as an older woman, because at that point she was less worried about some kind of notion of respectability politics. But that's not true at all. She was much more involved in activism from earlier on. And what we see when we get up to the 1920s, for instance, once women gain the right to vote, she takes on the National Women's Party and Alice Paul and demands that they pay attention to the fact that Black men and women throughout the South especially were still being disenfranchised and not able to vote. So she confronts her directly on numerous occasions, but never leaves the National Women's Party. She's a lifetime honorary, not an honorary, but a lifetime member of the National Women's Party. So she's fighting for the ERA and going to Congress to speak for the Equal Rights Amendment in the 30s, in the 40s, and in the 50s. So she's a really interesting figure, and she brings the National Association of Colored Women with her. They are strong supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment, and of course they had been supporters of suffrage. And I think a lot of that had to do with her leadership. So one of the things that I think is fun about writing a biography is that you can cover the person's entire life. A lot of people focus on the turn of the century when looking at Mary Church Terrell. But what I found to be really fascinating was to look at some of the decades that have been completely ignored. And one area or decade that's really under researched has been the 1930s. And the 1930s is a fascinating time for her because she's in her 70s and she's been a strong Republican who got jobs working on various presidential campaigns. Once women got the right to vote, she was hired to be the director of so-called colored women's votes in the Eastern District of the United States. And so she went around giving speeches, explaining to people the importance of voting and why they needed to be able to do it, and of course supporting the Republican Party. She was very much a Party of Lincoln Republican, thinking of the Republican Party as the party that had helped to emancipate the slaves. And so she was always very suspicious of the Democratic Party, which had been the party of secession and explicitly after the war called itself the party of white supremacy. So she was never comfortable with that party. And that created a problem for her in the 1930s as the Democratic Party started to shift with the rise of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. So what I document in the chapters on the 1930s is her struggle for employment, because one of the other things is that we think of her as very elite, but she also was very worried about her finances and had moments where she was in real trouble, especially if she did want to keep a kind of middle and upper middle class appearance. And the Depression was really, really hard for her. So she ended up getting a job in a New Deal relief agency and was discriminated against. Maybe in part because of her age, because this was a time when not many people who were 70 were working at all, but especially for a Black woman, that's almost inconceivable that she would manage to get these low-level jobs as clerks. But what she found was an incredible amount of racial hostility, some of it very open and some of it what we would call microaggressions today. But she fought against them in every case. And even as she was working in the federal government in 1934, for example, she was leading and participating in pickets and boycotts of stores and restaurants in Washington, D.C. that were not hiring Black workers. So it was the Don't Shop Where You Can't Work campaigns. And so once again, it's a case of the continuity between her earlier protests and the kinds of protests that she was involved in, showing that she was doing this kind of picketing, that she was supporting unions and working for workers' rights long before the late 1940s and 1950s, when historians have been picking up the story and seeing what she was doing then. So to me, what's really interesting about it is to see how active she was. The other thing that I would mention is that since it's a biography and I wanted to talk as much about her personal life as her private life, an interesting component of the 1930s is that by then her beloved husband, Robert H. Terrell, had died and she was a widow, but she became involved in a relationship with another man who in a way was almost the only kind of person who could take Robert Terrell's place. And this was a man of great public stature and a good reputation as a fighter for civil rights and as somebody who had a leadership role in the community. And that was, unfortunately, perhaps a married man, the first Black representative to Congress from the North ever, and the first Black representative in Congress since Reconstruction, and that was Oscar DePriest. And I was pretty amazed to find out about this affair, and then spend a chapter using her diary and letters to explore and understand, you know, what the bond was between them. And he was 7 years younger, and they, you know, but a lot of their relationship was based on the fact that they were both determined to continue to be in the Republican Party. And so their relationship was physical and emotional, but also was kind of intellectual and political. So that's another interesting part of the story that has been missed up to now.
Right. I mean, she sounds just this fascinating combination of, she sounds fearless, but she also sounds incredibly pragmatic, that she will triage if she has to, that she, and that's just not something, I mean, that's what women are, you know, but you don't necessarily get that as in biography, especially of an earlier period, at least the biographies I read. So what, you know, if she were around today, I keep thinking about the election, obviously, and that hopefully the Democratic Party will have a female vice presidential candidate. This is so interesting. I don't know if it's because of the pandemic and everybody's Zooming, but I'm sure you've seen, you know, these potential candidates. It almost seems like they're being asked to say, yes, I would happily run. And it just seems so public in some ways. You know, what do you think what advice would she have for these candidates? And, you know, the short list, you know, these are all public women with various degrees of causes and commitments, and I would say at various points of the political spectrum that Mary Church Terrell has seemed to embrace. I mean, you have Klobuchar, who has probably done more work across the aisle, Harris, who has made some decisions, you know, that transcend race, and that has gotten her some criticism. You have Warren, you know, who's probably as far on the left. You know, what kind of advice would she give these women? And I guess I'm thinking a lot about just intersectionality advice, not so much in terms of identity, but in terms of politics with a small p, about, you know, everything one needs to embrace, or as women are expected to embrace and advocate.
Well, I think that she definitely would want to take advantage of the moment to have a discussion about the way that race is impacting the pandemic. and that the structural inequalities of racism are clear in who's dying and who's getting sicker, and that has a long history. She had taken that on as an issue for the National Association of Colored Women back in the 1890s, looking at the fact that Black women back then had much higher infant and maternal death rates, and she herself had several miscarriages, a stillbirth, a baby who died tragically right at birth, a whole variety of really traumatic experiences that made her understand personally what was happening to Black women generally. And so she was always looking at those issues and wanting politicians to talk about those issues and to make those kinds of connections. So to be fearless about saying, this is not a coincidence. You know, there's a point where President Trump said, I don't know why Black people are dying more. Well, it's structural racism and it's the legacy of slavery. And that's, you know, and she would want to be as clear as possible about that.
Right.
And so that's what I would say that she would say. She would also be really interested in the Say Her Name movement and the hashtag Say Her Name. She spent a lot of time working for women who were caught up unjustly in the criminal justice system, young Black girls especially, who were accused of murder if they killed someone in self-defense or you know, had resisted rape or various other things like that. And she always connected those kinds of things back to the legacy of rape and attack and assault on Black women who couldn't defend themselves. So she was extremely sympathetic to these points of view. So the prison reform movement today and the question about ending mass incarceration is really a crucial thing for her. And the last thing I would say is that she always said that she personally would have loved to run, in her mind, what she talked about was running for the US Senate. And she said she would have liked to do that, but didn't feel that it was, basically there was no space for a Black woman to take on that role. So in 1929, one of the highlights of her political life was when she ended up helping run the campaign of Ruth Hanna McCormick, who was running to be senator of the state of Illinois. And she won in the primary, but then lost in the general election, but partly because it was the shift of voters to the Democrats at that point. Right. But it was a really exciting moment for her to be part of that political movement. But she said, I would have liked to be the person who was the candidate. So right. She would be delighted if it were a Black woman, of course. So that's what I would say.
Right. Well, let's say, I guess to try to end this on a silver lining, you know, her dream of, you know, we've gotten to the Senate in numbers that we would not expect. Fingers crossed, we'll see what happens in November, and in 2 years, perhaps we'll flip the Congress.
Yeah.
So there's so much more in this biography, which will be out in the fall. December is the publication date. It's available for pre-order now. And expect to see, hear, and read more from Alison, because, you know, if she's made anything clear in this interview, it's that the causes that Mary Church Terrell championed are far from over, that the leadership she showed provides a wonderful education for current and I hope future leaders, you know, I hope that this will be used, you know, by some teachers who will distill some of the things that she did in her life to girls today. Certainly, I will, you know, if my daughter is learning remotely, I'm definitely going to want to take some bits and pieces from this biography and figure out how to teach it to a 10-year-old, because there are a lot of lessons there that we can all learn from. So Alison, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Enjoy your summer, stay healthy, and more to come. For the rest of you, I hope you have a wonderful virtual Berks and buy the book. Take care.
Thank you. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.